we refer to that object there as a tree, but we also refer to this thing as a tree. But yet, if you found a pile, like somewhere I can find a pile of mush, that's the result of this. You know, so you go from a nut to a sapling to a full mature, looks like a poplar in this case, to this dead thing. Most people would call all of those things a tree. This one word encompasses all these different variations on this idea of a tree. But at some point, the consensus would cease to call it a tree, even though it's along the same process. Like somewhere in all this mess here, I could find something more decayed than this. Right over there, you see a rotting log that has a bunch of fungus growing all over it. And beyond that, eventually it becomes just a pile of mush. And then beyond that, eventually it becomes topsoil over, you know, given enough time. But at some point you would cease to call it a tree. You would start qualifying it like, well, that's a rotted tree, or that's the remains of a rotted tree, until eventually it's just soil. I mean, the stuff we're walking on here, it's just detritus. You know, it's understood that it came from trees, but you no longer identify it with this idea of tree. So what that shows is that our language involves a system of terms which don't necessarily pertain to concrete realities. They're convenient labels for carving up the range of experiences before us. So, and which applies to evolution, by the way, because what Darwin realized, and I mean, you can read this in Daniel Dennett's book, Darwin's Dangerous Idea. He goes into this pretty well, that one thing that Darwinism destroyed was the Aristotelian idea of concrete species going through time, where so a mature horse gives birth to a baby horse, which grows up to be a mature horse, which gives birth to a baby horse, yada yada. Down the line, it's guaranteed by the essence of horseness that horses will always be horses forever, so long as time and space exists. But what Darwin showed was that's not necessarily the case. Just because we have the term horse doesn't mean that we're referring to some metaphysical static reality that all particular horses reflect. At one point there was something not quite a horse, something quasi-horse-like, and if evolution were to continue in the future, there'd be something, again, not quite horse-like, but which came out of what we now call a horse. There's a range, you know, in the center of which you definitely call it a horse, and then at the perimeters, it becomes questionable. Do we call this animal a horse? Well, it's horse-like. It depends on consensus, and it's nominalism is the philosophical term. You're not referring to essences outside of the term. The language is bound up with human usage. So that Darwinism as a science also had philosophical implications. I remember studying Aristotle as an undergraduate philosophy student, and trying to reconcile that with my understanding of modern day biology, at the center of which is evolution by natural selection. I thought, you know, this has been falsified. This idea of immanent essences determining the sorts of objects that we perceive, this theory is outdated, which has the further reflection, which generated the further reflection for me that empirical findings and scientific models of knowledge can have a bearing on philosophical inquiries as well, and vice versa. But I never thought of that before. I just thought, you know, philosophy is independent and science can't touch it. But man, it seems like it can.